All right, so today we're diving into something a little different. We've got this fictional podcast from 2030,
Okay.
and it's looking back at a moment in history, actually 2025, when things in the Middle East could have gone in a totally different direction.
Hmm.
So it's like a what if, like one of those choose your own adventure books, but with global politics.
Yeah, that guy.
And the way this 2030 podcast starts is pretty interesting. It's this grandfather telling his granddaughter about 2025, and they're walking along a beach on Long Island.
Okay.
And get this, they see Chinese warships just off the coast.
Whoa, that's not something you see every day, right?
Exactly. It's like,
Right.
wait a minute, how did we get to a point where Chinese warships are just casually cruising by Long Island?
Yeah, it makes you wonder what happened, what led to that kind of shift in the global balance of power.
Right? Like, rewind back to 2025, and this fictional podcast lays out some pretty wild stuff going on. First off, Trump gets reelected.
Okay, so yeah, politically that's going to be a big deal.
Yeah, you can imagine the political divisions in the U.S. are just getting amplified.
Right. And probably globally too.
And then on top of that, things really start to heat up in the Middle East.
Uh-oh.
A major Arab-Israeli war breaks out.
Oh, wow.
But this isn't just your typical back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Hamas, the group that controls the Gaza Strip, they actually score some early victories that shock everyone. They launch this massive surprise attack on Israeli civilians, take hostages, and cause a ton of casualties.
That's awful. That would definitely escalate things quickly.
It's a horrific scenario. I mean, the whole region is just thrown into chaos.
So it's not just Israel and Hamas at this point, right? It's got to be bigger than that.
Yeah, it quickly becomes this huge regional war. The source describes thousands of missiles raining down on Israel, not just from Gaza, but from Iran and its allies in Lebanon and Yemen. Everyone's picking sides.
Wow, so it's like the whole region is going up in flames.
Basically, and this is where the what if comes in. The grandfather in the podcast asks, could a U.S.-Turkey free trade agreement have actually prevented this whole war?
Okay, so back up a sec. Why Turkey? What makes them so important in all of this?
Well, Turkey's kind of like the linchpin in the whole region. Geographically, it connects Europe and the Middle East. It's part of NATO.
Right, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is that military alliance between the U.S., Canada, and a bunch of European countries.
Exactly. And on top of that, Turkey has all these economic and political ties with other countries in the Middle East.
So they're kind of playing both sides a bit.
In a way, yeah. So the idea is if the U.S. and Turkey were more aligned economically and strategically through this free trade agreement, it could have really shifted the balance of power.
Actually, so a stronger Turkey would be more stable,
Yeah.
less likely to be influenced by Russia or Iran, and a bigger help to the U.S. in the region.
Exactly. And if the U.S. and Turkey were like best buds, it might make other countries in the Middle East think twice before getting too cozy with Iran, right?
Yeah, definitely. The source actually uses this analogy of a line connecting Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Turkey. If those three were a united front with the U.S. backing them up, it could have been a major deterrent to Iranian aggression and maybe prevented the war altogether.
Makes sense. But instead, what happens that the U.S. is already kind of exhausted from years of conflict in the Middle East, so they hesitate, don't fully commit to Turkey or building this alliance.
And then,
And then, bam, the war explodes and everything changes.
yeah, that hesitation, that lack of decisive action, that's what the grandfather in the podcast sees as the missed opportunity.
Right.
Because who steps in when the U.S. takes a backseat? Russia, Iran, and, who else? China?
And that brings us right back to those Chinese warships off Long Island. It's like the ultimate symbol of how America's retreat from the Middle East. Its failure to seize that opportunity with Turkey allowed other global powers to step in and challenge its dominance.
It's kind of chilling when you think about it.
Definitely. And we'll get into what happens to the Palestinians and all this chaos in part 2 of this deep dive. Okay, so we've got this powder keg in the Middle East.
Yeah.
The U.S. maybe could have kept things stable with Turkey, but they don't. War breaks out, and by 2030, Chinese warships are hanging out off Long Island.
Yeah, and that just shows you what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. Those warships are like a big flashing sign saying, hey, look, a conflict on one side of the world can totally shake up the whole balance of power.
It's like dropping a pebble in a pond. Those ripples just keep spreading.
One decision, or, not making a decision in this case, sets off a whole chain reaction, and suddenly the whole world's different.
I still can't get over this idea of a U.S.-Turkey alliance being the thing that changes everything. What would that have even looked like on the ground?
Well, this source gets into the whole economic side. Think about a free trade agreement that opens up Turkish markets to American companies and the other way around.
More trade, more investment.
Jobs on both sides. A wealthier Turkey is a Turkey that's less likely to bend to pressure from Russia or China.
So it's not just about military power, it's about who's got the stronger economy.
Right, and the source even talks about the cultural stuff. Turkey's this mix of East and West, a tighter bond with the U.S., could have meant more cultural exchange, people understanding each other better.
Building bridges, not walls, as they say. And maybe all that understanding could have even helped with the whole Palestinian question.
Now, there's a thought, remember the Abraham Accords from a few years ago where Israel started making nice with some Arab states?
Yeah, big news back then, but didn't really stick, did it?
Nope. But this source says if Turkey had been in the mix, really involved in making peace, things could have gone differently. A stable Middle East, everyone doing well, U.S., Turkey, Saudi Arabia, all on the same page, that could have put out the fire before it even started.
Okay, so that's the happy ending, but that's not what happened, right? The U.S. waffles, war breaks out, and the Palestinians are left holding the bag while everything goes crazy.
And that takes us back to those warships. The grandfather sees them as what happens when America doesn't step up, when it had the chance to team up with Turkey and make the Middle East a better place.
Kind of like he's saying we had the chance to write a different story, but we dropped the pen.
He doesn't say it straight out, but you can tell there's this feeling of, what if, things could have been so much better if the U.S. had just thought ahead and been a little braver?
It's a good reminder that we need to learn from our mistakes.
Yeah.
But does the source give us any other options besides this Turkey deal? I mean, were there other ways for the U.S. to keep its power in the Middle East?
That's where the story kind of stops. The grandfather leaves us with those warships, and the question of what might have been, it's like he's saying, okay, now it's your turn. What would you have done?
It's kind of mind-blowing to think that one decision or even indecision can have such a huge impact years down the line. And I mean, here we are in 2023, this fictional podcast from 2030. It makes you look at what's happening right now in a totally different way.
Yeah, it really shows you how complicated this whole global chessboard is. What happens over there can definitely come back to bite us over here.
Like that butterfly effect thing, right? A butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil and we get a hurricane in Florida.
Exactly. And I think what's really important to remember is that we're not just watching all this happen. We're actually part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Our choices, what we do, even what we don't do, it all shapes the future.
So we got to be informed, right? Pay attention to what's going on in the world, get involved, and realize that we're not just along for the ride, we're actually helping steer the ship.
That's it. And it starts with thinking for ourselves, questioning things, looking at all sides of the story, not just believing everything we hear.
This podcast is a perfect example. It throws this crazy what if at you and forces you to think about the world in a whole new way.
Definitely gets those brain cells firing.
It makes me wonder what other options were out there back in 2025. I mean, the source talks about this Turkey deal, but were there other ways for the U.S. to stay on top in the Middle East?
Now, that's a million-dollar question. Could they have gone all in on diplomacy, really tried to get Israel and Palestine back to the negotiating table? Or maybe focused on building up alliances that weren't just about military stuff.
Right, more like economic partnerships, cultural exchanges, stuff like that.
Exactly. It's all about thinking outside the box. And that's what I love about these kinds of thought experiments. They get you thinking about solutions you might not have considered before.
It's like the grandfather in the podcast is giving us this puzzle to solve and saying, all right, you try it. What would you have done differently?
And that's the challenge, right?
Yeah.
Learn from the past, figure out where we are now, and use all that to make smarter choices for the future.
So to everyone listening, as you keep learning about the Middle East, and let's face it, it's always changing. Remember this deep dive. Remember that history is full of what ifs, and those what ifs can help us understand the choices we're making right now.
Keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and most importantly, stay engaged with the world around you. The future's not set in stone, and we all have a part in writing it.